On a gray February morning in 1945, somewhere over the frozen farmlands of eastern Germany, a 26-year-old American pilot named Katherine Mitchell felt her aircraft shudder as anti-aircraft fire tore through the fuselage, and she knew in that instant that she was going to crash, and that if she survived the impact, she would be alone in enemy territory with no weapon, no radio, and no one coming to rescue her because, officially, Katherine Mitchell did not exist, and the aircraft she was flying was never supposed to be anywhere near the front lines. Katherine had grown up in Wichita, Kansas, in a family that lived and breathed aviation because her father was an aircraft mechanic at one of the factories that would later build the bombers that won the war, and she had learned to fly before she learned to drive, and by the time she was 18, she had more hours in the cockpit than most men twice her age, and she knew that flying was not just what she did, but who she was, and that nothing would ever keep her on the ground. When the war came, Katherine tried to enlist as a military pilot, but was told that women could not fly combat missions, and so she joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP program that trained women to ferry aircraft from factories to bases, freeing male pilots for combat duty, and she flew every type of aircraft in the American arsenal, from nimble fighters to massive bombers. She proved again and again that she could fly anything that had wings. But what happened next changed everything, because in late 1944, Katherine was recruited for a classified program that officially did not exist, and that involved women pilots flying special missions that could not be acknowledged, and she was told that the work was dangerous, and that if anything went wrong she would be on her own, and that she could never speak about what she did, and she said yes without hesitation because this was what she had been waiting for her entire life. The mission that brought her down over Germany was supposed to be a simple delivery flight carrying a high intelligence officer from England to a forward airbase in France, but bad weather had pushed them off course and they had strayed too close to German positions, and the anti-aircraft batteries had found them, and now Katherine was fighting a dying aircraft while her passenger screamed in the seat behind her. And then something no one expected happened, because Katherine managed to keep the aircraft in the air long enough to cross a frozen river that marked the nominal front line, and she brought it down in a controlled crash in a field that turned out to be not quite as far behind Allied lines as she had hoped, and she and her passenger survived the impact, but the passenger had a broken leg and could not walk, and they were still miles from safety. What she discovered next would shake her understanding of what she was capable of, because Katherine realized that she had a choice. She could leave the wounded officer and try to reach Allied lines on her own, or she could stay and try to save them both, and she chose to stay, because leaving someone behind was not something Katherine Mitchell knew how to do, and because the officer was carrying intelligence documents that could not fall into German hands. Behind these frozen fields, a secret waited, because Katherine did not know that. German patrols had seen the crash and were already moving to investigate, and she had perhaps an hour before they arrived, and she had to find shelter, and she had to find it fast, and so she hoisted the wounded officer onto her back and began walking toward a farmhouse she had spotted from the air just before they went down. The farmhouse was occupied by an elderly German couple who looked at this American woman in a flight suit carrying a wounded man, and who faced a decision of their own, because helping enemy soldiers was punishable by death, but turning away wounded strangers was something they could not do, and they opened their door and let Katherine in, and they helped her hide the officer in their root cellar, and they said nothing when the German patrol arrived an hour later. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because the German soldiers searched the farmhouse and found nothing, and they questioned the elderly couple, who lied with the calm conviction of people who had decided that human decency mattered more than national loyalty, and they moved on, and Katherine and a passenger were safe for the moment, but they were still deep in enemy territory, with no way to contact Allied forces. She stayed in that farmhouse for 11 days, caring for the wounded officer and waiting for an opportunity to move, and the elderly couple fed them from their meager supplies and risked their lives every moment, and Katherine learned their names, Hans and Elsa Brenner, and she learned that they had lost their only son on the Eastern Front, and that they had no love for the Nazi regime that had destroyed their family, and that they helped her, not because she was American, but because she was human. The breakout came on the 12th day, when Katherine heard American artillery in the distance and knew that the front lines were moving, and she made the decision to try to reach them, and she fashioned a sled from barn materials, and she loaded the officer onto it, and she said goodbye to Hans and Elsa, and she set off across the frozen landscape toward the sound of the guns. The journey took 3 days and 2 nights, and Katherine pulled that sled through snow and ice and across frozen streams, and she hid from German patrols, and she kept the officer alive when fever threatened to take him, and she ate nothing because there was nothing to eat. And she slept only when exhaustion forced her to, and she kept moving toward the guns because stopping meant dying. She reached American lines on February 28, 1945, and she walked out of the forest pulling her sled, and the first American soldier who saw her later said that he thought she was a ghost because she was so thin and so pale and so covered in ice that she did not look human, and when she opened her mouth and spoke English, he almost shot her from shock. The officer she saved turned out to be more important than she had known, carrying documents that revealed the locations of German V-2 rocket facilities and the intelligence he brought back contributed to bombing missions that destroyed those facilities and saved countless Allied lives, and Katherine Mitchell had not just survived. She had completed her mission in ways that no one could have predicted. The Army did not know what to do with her because officially her mission had never happened, and officially women did not fly combat aircraft, and officially she could not be decorated for actions that were classified. And so they gave her a quiet commendation and a handshake, and sent her back to her regular duties, and told her to never speak about what had happened. She kept that silence for more than 50 years, because she had given her word, and because the people who had helped her, including Hans and Elsa Brenner, might still be endangered if the story came out. And she returned to Kansas after the war, and she got married and had children, and she flew small planes at the local airfield. And she never told anyone about those 11 days in Germany. The declassification of wartime records in the 1990s finally revealed her story, and historians began piecing together what had happened, and they tracked down Katherine, who was now in her 70s and living in a retirement community in Arizona, and they asked her to tell her story, and she agreed because Hans and Elsa were long dead and because she wanted people to know what women had done during the war. She returned to Germany in 1998 at the age of 7, and she found the farmhouse where she had hidden, and she discovered that Hans and Elsa had been honored as righteous among the nations for hiding Jewish refugees earlier in the war, and that their courage in helping her had been just one chapter in a lifetime of quiet heroism, and she wept at their graves and thanked them for saving her life. The Air Force finally gave Katherine the recognition she deserved in 2001, awarding her the Distinguished Flying Cross 56 years after a crash landing, and the ceremony was attended by descendants of the intelligence officer she had saved and by historians and journalists who had helped bring her story to light, and Katherine accepted the medal with characteristic modesty, saying she'd only done what any pilot would do. She continued flying until she was 82 years old, because she said that being in the cockpit was the only place she ever felt truly free, and she taught her grandchildren to fly. And she gave talks at schools and museums about her experiences, and she always emphasized that the real heroes were people like Hans and Elsa, who risked everything to help strangers, and who proved that human kindness could survive even in the darkest times. Katherine Joan Mitchell died in 2012 at the age of 93, and her funeral was attended by pilots from around the country who came to honor one of the pioneers of women in aviation, and her ashes were scattered from an airplane over the Kansas prairie, where she had first learned to fly and where she had always felt most at home. Her story was finally told in full in a documentary released in 2015. That included interviews recorded before her death and testimony from historians who had researched her missions, and the film brought her story to a new generation and inspired young women to pursue careers in aviation and the military, and Katherine would have been embarrassed by all the attention because she never saw herself as a hero. She was asked once in an interview what she had been thinking during those 11 days hiding in the farmhouse, and she said she had been thinking about her father, who had taught her to fly, and who had always said that a pilot never gives up, and she said she had been thinking about the officer she was responsible for, and about the documents he was carrying, and she said she had not thought about herself at all because there was no time for self. That is the legacy of Katherine Joan Mitchell, the female pilot who crash-landed behind enemy lines, and who proved that courage and skill have no gender, and that the women who served in World War II were every bit as brave as the men in her story reminds us that the full history of the war includes countless heroes whose names we are only now beginning to learn and whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered.